Hello, welcome back to the Fruit of Grisaia. This has become psychological torture at this point. I'm getting psychologically destroyed by this route. With those brief words, Mr. Ochi turned his back on us and immediately began to walk off. Lingering for a long farewell would have been a waste of daylight hours. Once inside the forest, a thick tree canopy would block out most of the sun's light. We knew all too well how poor his visibility would be in this rain, which would soon transform the jungle into a misty, unfamiliar labyrinth. Of course, some suggested postponing any action until the weather improved, but if we delayed over the rain, it felt entirely possible we'd keep finding excuses to put off that first step. Maybe tomorrow it would be too hot, or somebody would feel too sick. Before long, sheer inertia would wheel us to our comfortable sleeping bags. Because he understood that, Mr. Ochi had made the firm decision to leave today, regardless of conditions. We watched him marching bravely down toward the forest, unable to keep the unease from our faces. If we'd had little rising sunflies to flap around, we wouldn't have looked out of place in a 60-year-old photograph. But unlike the relatives of those doomed soldiers, our anxiety was accompanied by an undercurrent of guilt. We weren't afraid for our teacher's well-being. We were worried about our own uncertain future.
先生、大丈夫かな?
The words spilled spontaneously out of my mouth. Sakuma Senpai, who'd been standing at my side throughout the little ceremony, glanced over.
まあ正直、あまり期待しない方がいいね。
Sakuma's tone of voice was resigned, almost detached. The first to respond was Hirooka, who'd been standing at her partner's side, her limbs shivering in the cold rain.
私たちの食料、半分も持って行ったんですよ。顔出してくれなきゃ困りますよ。
Haneda Senpai, as always, scratching vigorously away at the bandage of on her forehead, gave a little snort of laughter at Ibuki's words.
あれでも一応大学時代はテニス部だったんでしょ。体力はあるんじゃないの?
Next in line stood Komori-san, her miniature dog's face peeping out from the neck of her school uniform.
どうしてテニス部だった人がバスケ部の顧問やってるんでしょう?
At Komori's other side, Sakurai was pressing her hands against her stomach wound, bending over slightly to shield it from the rain. As the conversation seemed to be moving neatly down the line, she tentatively opened her mouth and spoke.
大学のテニス部って要は女の子目当てのナンパな男子が集まる部でしょ。冬はスキー部になったりする感じの。
Apparently unused to hear these words from the normally meek and refined Sakurai Senpai, Kazuki chuckled lightly at her side.
その認識で間違ってないところが悲しいわね。
Her eyes fixed on Mr. Ochi as his figure grew small in the distance. Koide Senpai responded to Kazuki's words with an anxious frown.
本当大丈夫なのかな?
Now that he had set forth, there was nothing more we could do either way. It was in the hands of fate now. Sakuma Senpai gave a wry little snort. Lately, her prowess at playing cards had allowed her to push most of her chores onto others, and her attitude was getting increasingly irreverent as her leisure time grew.
あとはもう運布天賦に任せるしかないね。分の悪い賭けだけど、賭けってのはその方が面白いよ。
Clearly irritated by Sakuma's flippant tone, Captain Sakashida finally broke her silent vigil.
遊びじゃないのよ。くだらない冗談を言っている暇があるなら、他にやるべきことがいくらでもあるでしょ。はいはい、ごめんよ。
Sakuma's typically indifferent response earned her a brief, withering glare. After a moment, the captain turned sharply on her heel and stalked off toward her tent without another word. Heaving a small sigh at this abrupt departure, Koide gave a light nod of acknowledgement to Kazuki and trotted off to follow her partner.
はいはい、ごめんよ。
Sakuma's typically indifferent response earned her a brief, withering glare. After a moment, the captain turned sharply on her heel and stalked off toward her tent without another word.
なんかさ、坂下を見てるとこういう状況でも怒鳴り散らすだけの人間がどれだけ惨めかって思い知らされるよね。彼女を見ているとしっかりしなきゃって逆に落ち着いてくるよ。そういう意味ではいい反面教師だ。
Obeying someone simply because they shout any voices of opposition is the height of foolishness. Over the days we'd spent here, that realization had sunk deeply into our very bones. At moments like these, everyone's gaze would naturally settle on Kazuki. They turned to our freshman, a small girl no taller than 150 centimeters, with eyes of absolute trust. The third years among us were no exception. The vaguely rebellious Sakuma seemed to have concluded in characteristically happy-go-lucky style that, when Kazami's around, life's a lot easier. And having essentially entrusted her life to Kazuki as a patient, Sakurai-senpai had even begun to politely address her with an honorific.
言い方はどうあれ、坂下部長の言葉に間違いがないのも事実です。寒暖じみた愚痴り合いをしている暇があれば食べ物を探しましょう。
There is no changing the fact that we've given half of our already meager stockpile to Mr. Ochi. From today on, our meals would be all the more grumpily austere. Even so, he'd only taken enough food for 2 days, along with 2 liters of sterilized water in plastic bottles. From a simple estimate of the calories he'd be consuming and burning, he'd last 4 days at the longest. Although Mr. Ochi had estimated that 3 days of consistent progress would bring him to human habitation, we all knew perfectly well that he wouldn't be able to simply stroll straight through that forest. But he himself was probably more familiar with that harsh reality than any of us, so we kept our silence.
ああ、この雨の中森に入るのか。何言ってんですか。どうせ森に入ってもフラフラしてるだけで全然働かないくせに。仕方がないよ、私は貴族だからね。一つお願いがあるんですけどいいですか。なんだい、言ってごらんよ。一度本気で殴らせてください。いいえ、みんなのために単身森に入った越智先生に代わって先輩を殴ります。それで君の気が晴れるのならそうするといい。あまり痛くしないでもらえると助かるかな。だから髪に触らないでください。
Harshly slapping aside Sakuma Senpai's hand, Ibuki stamped off toward the forest alone. Watching her partner go, Sakuma spread her arms, turned her palms to the sky, and offered an exaggerated shrug of the shoulders to no one in particular. But soon enough, she followed without a word. All said and done, they were a friendly pair.
私らはどうする？
Fiddling with her rain-wet bandage as she brushed her hair out of her eyes, Kaneda-senpai turned to address her partner, Komori. Staring down at the deck, dog on deck, nestled against her chest, Komori-senpai answered in an apologetic tone of voice.
すみません。今日はアー君の具合が悪いみたいで。またかよ。なんかその犬、雨が降るとすぐ体調崩すよね。やっぱあれか？湿度が高いと前髪が決まんなくて超下げなんですけどみたいな感じになるのかね。まさかそれはないと思いますけど。まあいいよ、今日は私が行くからさ、あんたは犬と一緒にテントで待ってな。すみません。
Kaneda set off her brow strides, apparently trying to play up her self-assigned role as the manly big brother of the household. Komori hurried off as well, leaning over the dog in her uniform to shield it from the elements. Well then, what about us? When I glanced over in Kazuki's direction, I was surprised to find Sakurai-senpai still loitering quietly by her side. When our eyes met, Sakura gave me a gentle look. Look. Smile. Yeah, smile probably. I think a smile.
桜井先輩はどうされます？
今までの恩返しもありますし、できれば食材探しに私も参加させてもらえればと。
それは助かりますけど、大丈夫なんですか？はい、
お腹の怪我ももうだいぶ良くなってきましたし。
ダメよ。
でも
気持ちはわかるしありがたいけれど、今無理をすればまた悪化するわよ。桜井さんはテントに戻って広岡さんについていてあげてください。
つまんない。
食材探しだって別に楽しくはないわ。もともとあなたは体が丈夫ではないのだし、おとなしく私の言うことを聞きなさい。
はーい。
今の何？
くしゃみよ。
でも今ペキュって言ったよ。
一見すると欠点が少ないように見える桜井さんだけれど、どうにもくしゃみが変なのよね、この人。
気にしてるのに。
いいからさっさとテントに戻りなさい。この上風邪をひいたりしたらまた私の仕事が増えるじゃないの。
はいはい。
Smiling sweetly, Sakurai patted Kazuki on the head, and obediently walked off toward her tent, that is, the large tent where Hirooka-san was waiting.
桜井先輩、美人だね。
そうね、性格もおとなしいし、本当に欠点の少ない人だわ。もうお腹が出るような水着は着れないと思うけれど。
そっか。
As he watched Sakurai-senpai walk away, her thin arms shielding her stomach, Kazuki's profile betrayed a hint of sadness. Sakurai's parents had probably been planning to bring their daughter into the world of show business sooner or later. What would they think when they saw that wound across her belly? An ugly, jagged, dark red gash, discharging pus faster than we could clean and disinfect it. Would they be overjoyed their daughter had at least survived, or hurt by her misfortune?
私たちも行きましょう。
そうだね。
When I stared down at the misty jungle, I could see the indistinct shapes of human beings wriggling through the trees in search of sustenance. We were stumbling in fog, nothing to guide us, nothing but the unknown ahead, clawing desperately for survival. How long would this go on? How long until fortune smiled on us? How long until we could rest? What will be, will be. There's no way to know how this will end. For now, we just need to do what we can. For now, those words were still enough to keep my feet moving, but I was beginning to feel that the limits of my endurance might be approaching. Even so, as Kazami Kazuki made her way down the valley, the only thought in my mind was to follow her. By now, I'd stopped even considering any other course of action. The 10th day in the valley.
また雨だ。もううんざり。雨が降ると途端に体がだるくなる。頭が重い。テントの中にいても雨はどんどん染み込んでくるし、慢性化した湿気が原因なのか、苔だかカビだかの青臭いような匂いがますます濃くなってくる。ここ数日の雨の様子はほとんど梅雨の様相だ。今度の雨は相当にしつこい。当分やみそうもない。
テントを叩く雨粒の音でなんとなくそうわかる。梢の隙間を伝って育った大きな雨粒がテントに当たる音は不規則で、ずっと聞いているとイライラしてくる。満たされない空腹もまたイライラの原因だった。もはや口癖のように、ああお腹が空いたと私が口にすれば、最近の和樹は眉を寄せる。そんなこと言われなくても分かっているわと機嫌が悪くなるのだ。それでも私が空腹を訴え続ければ、最後にはうるせえ、寝ちまえ。ちょっと、私はそんなことを言った覚えはないわよ。私は動く必要のない時には眠るのも立派な仕事よと言っただけでしょ。やだな和樹、勝手に私の日記を読まないでよ。読んでないわよ。あなたが日記を書きながらそれを声に出して勝手に私に聞かせていたんでしょ。嘘。自覚なし。重症ね。気をつけなさい、Amane。まるで一人でブツブツと文句を言いながら料理をするとんかつ屋の主人みたいで気持ち悪いわよ。何それ、よくわかんないけど、人の顔を真剣に見つめてキモいとか言わんといてもらえる？へこむわ。ほら、私が捕まえたカタツムリをあげるから、これでも食べて元気を出しなさい。もうでんでん虫飽きた。っていうか虫以外のものが食べたいよ。カタツムリは陸外よ。まあ貝は虫じゃないのかと言われると微妙なのだけれど、それよりAmane。
Kazuki pointed to her cheek with one finger, as if to tell me I had a grain of rice stuck to the corner of my mouth. After a brief moment of confusion, I brought my hand up to my face. My fingers quickly found something slimy on my cheek. That is to say, a leech. I'd grown exceptionally tough-minded about this sort of thing. Another leech wasn't going to get a scream out of me this late in the game. Carefully peeling the creature off my cheek, I held it between the fingertips of both hands, dug my nails into its body, and ripped it apart. This was another lovely side effect of the rain. Leeches had begun to find their way inside our tent. After waking up, peeling the bloodsuckers off my body was becoming the first part of my daily routine. First and foremost, I had to peel them off my eyelids. Next, the one sticking to my neck, wrist, and ankles. The leeches seem to have a particular fondness for these points where the body grows narrow. Other than that, they'd also go for places where the skin was thin, the back of my knees and elbows, my armpits, my groin. There were even a few that burrowed in between my toes, as if trying to make themselves a cozy little nest. The first few times this happened, we'd shriek hysterically when we woke, but after a few days, we'd lost the will to even moan. And either our bodies had developed a resistance to Hirooka, or we just gotten used to treating the bites, as the trickle of blood from the wounds would now stop after only an hour or so. Kazuki speculated our growing sodium deficiency might be affecting the salinity of our blood, but there was no way to tell for sure. As the day crept into evening without a break in the rain, Kazuki and I headed to the large tent in order to visit Hirooka-san and Sakurai-senpai. Outside, I started the usual fire under the primitive stove, made the usual thin, watery meat soup, and boiled the usual bucket of hot water. With the gruel in my right hand and the hot water in my left, I made my way to the hospital tent. It was important to remember which was in which hand, since it was no longer obvious which was the water and which the gruel.
Calling it gruel was a bit of a joke by this point. At a glance, it looked more like stone soup. Even so, since we were mixing in a bit of the rice distributed to Kazuki and me, the wounded Sakurai and Hirooka were still eating slightly better than the rest of us.
お湯が沸いたよ。
ありがとう、アマネ。そこの手ぬぐいを熱湯で消毒して、広岡さんの体を拭いてあげてくれる？
うん、任せて。
Kazuki didn't turn around when I entered the tent. She was steadily unwinding the yellow-stained bandages from Sakurai's stomach and removing the gauze from her wound to be replaced. We'd washed the gauze over and over in boiling water to the point it was beginning to blacken. It made for all the more striking a contrast against the yellow pus that permeated its surface. No matter how many times we carefully disinfected Sakurai's laceration, the separation wasn't showing any signs of stopping. If we weren't in this situation, it surely wouldn't have been difficult to treat, but given our unsanitary conditions and utter lack of medical supplies, we simply couldn't stop the bacteria from multiplying. Above all else, the patient wasn't getting the nutrition her body needed to fight its way to recovery. When I reached out for the dirty gauze in order to sterilize it for reuse, I noticed something squirming on its surface. It was a maggot, thrashing its fat little body madly from within the depths of the pus head that had soaked into the gauze, it almost seeming to be incautiously trying to crawl back towards Sakurai's stomach.
こっちはいいから、広岡さんを。
Immersing the washcloth, a strip of cloth cut from an old t-shirt, in the hot water, I left it to soak and began to unbutton Hirooka-san's uniform. At first, she'd been quite embarrassed to be seen naked, but by now she submitted quietly without even squirming. She might simply have lost the energy necessary to feel shame. Hirooka-san's chest had withered dramatically since the first time I'd wiped her clean. Her ribs stood out distinctly against the surface of her skin. And that skin was mottled here and there with small white flecks. The small, fuzzy little spots could be dusted off by hand. At first, I thought them to be something like cotton dust from her sleeping bag. But when I asked Kazuki, I learned for the first time that mold can grow on a living human body. Hirooka-san was covered in pale white mildew.
ちょっと待ってね。今熱いタオルで拭いてあげるから。
私、もう。
何？なんて？
Hirooka's dry, cracked lips were moving slightly. I lowered my ear to her mouth.
私、死に。
大丈夫だよ。ちょっとカビが生えただけじゃん。
Scooping the washcloth out of the hot water with a pair of chopsticks, I waited for it to cool below scalding, then gave it a vigorous squeeze.
体中がかゆいの。気が変になりそう。
It's
我慢
hopeless.
して今きれいにしてあげるから。
I dropped the moderately hot towel against Hirooka-san's body and began to wipe. The mold came off cleanly, but underneath there were innumerable angry, swollen red welts where fingernails had dug into her flesh.
書いちゃダメって言ったのに。
The more she scratched, the more she spread the mold across her body.
ごめんなさい。どうしても。
Wide skill,
できなくて。
unrelenting itchiness is absolute torment. No matter how firmly you're told not to scratch, you'll unconsciously claw at your body while asleep. Hirooka-san's reflexive habit had grown so extreme that we'd actually tried binding her hands to prevent this. That night, she had woken the entire camp screaming. Writhing her body against her restraints, she had scraped her body against the hard ground, crying again and again for help.
ありがとう、スオさん。
気持ちいい。
When I wiped her body clean, the itchiness would reduce at once. She described it as almost a blissful sensation. Even so, that comfort will last an hour or two at most. Once wrapped up in her sleeping bag, the itchiness would return as her body temperature began to rise. I was now making the time-consuming trip to wipe her clean many times a day.
ごめんね、面倒ばっかりかけて。本当にごめんなさい。
大丈夫だよ。そんなこと言っちゃダメだよ。体を拭いてあげるぐらいいつだってしてあげるから元気出してよ。
If anything, it was bitterly sad to know there was nothing more I could do for her, no matter how hard I tried.
そうさん、私この
そうして。そのためには絶対に生き残らないとね。
私死んでも絶対にこの恩を忘れないよ。
As she spoke, tears began to run in little streams down Hirooka's Sam's face.
だからそういうこと言わないの。大丈夫、死なないから。
Wiping a tear from Hirooka's singed cheek with the tip of my finger, I reflexively brought it to my mouth. Hirooka-san's tears were still salty. I was slightly envious of that. It was a 11th day in the valley. It was still raining. It had never stopped raining. There was nothing to do but sit around shivering and wait for the weather to clear. Doing nothing all day took a surprisingly heavy toll in its own right. After 10 minutes or so of aimless idleness, you'd be seized by an anxious, impatient need to do something, anything. But it was impossible to step outside even briefly without being drenched in the downpour. The cold rain would drain your energy with terrifying swiftness, and once you got wet, you stayed that way. But wait, we knew it was dangerous to stay in soaked clothes, but we just didn't have the means to get them dry. The constant seeping rainwater had begun to corrode the thin material that made up the bottom of our tent. Lying down, even with the buffer of the sleeping mat, would leave our whole bodies sopping wet. We had no choice but to sit and wait. The horror. In the afternoon, the rain slowed to a heavy drizzle. I had just managed to get a cooking fire going when an eerie sound began to echo across the camp. Someone was singing loudly. It was unmistakably Ibuki's voice.
ついに行かれたか?
This is turning into a horror novel. Kaneda laughed harshly, an ugly, contorted excuse for a smile on her face.
うるせえぞイブキ!
In an attempt to end the mournful, grimace-inducing dirge, Kaneda-senpai hurled a rock in Ibuki's direction. The stone fell a few feet short, and Ibuki turned in our direction to examine it. Her face was ghastly white, her skin dull. It looked as though she had aged 20 years in the last few days. Picking up the muddy stone, Ibuki pressed it to her nose and sniffed curiously. Apparently deciding it wasn't food, she tossed it casually aside and continued her song. When the world grows warped around you, those who can't bend simply break. But watching Ibuki caterwauling idly up at the rain cloud-filled sky as if to summon the sun, I wondered if derangement might sometimes be a blessing rather than a curse.
なんなんだろうねあれ。たまにああやっておかしくなるけど、しばらくすると普通に会話できるし、いつものブッキーに戻ってるんだよね。
需要不足らしいですよ。
いつかは私らもあんな風になるのかね。
金田先輩、ここへ来る前ダイエットとかしてました？
うにゃ？
じゃあ大丈夫じゃないですか？
From what Kazuki had told me, Ibuki had been repeatedly subjecting herself to severe, gimmicky diets over the last few months, leaving her with chronic vitamin deficiencies. Since arriving here, that pre-existing condition had apparently worsened the effects of malnutrition on her body, giving rise to impaired brain function.
参っちゃうよね。うちの子守ももうだいぶやばい感じだよ。
Komari was still shut up in their tent, nursing her dog through a high fever. Apparently, she was feeding every scrap of her rations to the animal.
あいつの家和菓子屋じゃん。親は2人とも仕事で忙しくてめったに構ってもらえなかったみたいでさ。兄弟もいないあいつには犬が兄弟なんだよね。まあわかるけどさ。
Even as Kaneda spoke those carefully neutral words, her mouth was twisted with undisguised loathing. Her true feelings were written on her face. She unambiguously hated that feverish, immobile little dog. It was of no use to her, and so she wanted it to disappear. It was as simple as that.
みんなどんどん弱ってく。このまま私らみんな死ぬんだ。
I understood from the tone of her voice that this wasn't more of the usual gallows humor. I understood with such painful clarity that I wished she'd said nothing at all. Glancing up at the sky as the rain began to intensify yet again, I slowly picked myself up off my seat of rock. I can't take this. Couldn't we at least catch a break on this rain? It was adding insult to injury. Knowing full well that it was ridiculous, I did my best whiny preschooler impression and asked Kazuki to make the rain stop.
だから私は神様じゃないのよ。
似たようなもんでしょ。
Everyone called Kazuki a witch. Well, except for the ones who called her a monster. In that case, a little rain magic shouldn't be too much to ask for, right? I mean, I knew it was idiotic, but asking is free. In response to my challenge, Kazuki closed both eyes and exhaled heavily through her nose, as if to say, "Oh, very well then." And lifting both arms toward the sky, she spoke to the heavens. To wit, "O rain, I command you to be gone." An exceptionally half-hearted command that dissolved into an open-mouthed yawn at the end. I appreciated that she was considerate enough to play along with my nonsense, but if she was going to bother, couldn't she at least pretended she was taking it seriously? But, well, as it turned out, an hour or so after that, maybe, the rain really did come to a sudden stop. You had to laugh. Kazuki craned her neck back, idly gazing up as the clouds flowed peacefully by.
何でも試してみるものね。
And spoke characteristically impudent words in her characteristically sleepy voice. Staring at her face from the side, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The witch theory was seeming increasingly plausible. Not that, on reflection, I really cared if she was some sort of black magician. It'd be nice to have one on our side right about now. If I asked her to spirit everyone to safety for her next trick, I wonder what had happened. Asking's free, after all. I looked over at Kazuki, debating whether to throw this new challenge at her, but before I could decide, she stared up into my eyes and spoke.
全員は無理。そう言ったはずよ。
だから私が質問する前に答えを先に言うのはマナー違反だよ。
あなたは考えていることがすぐに顔に出るから分かりやすいのよね。
It can't be everyone. Her tone of voice was surprisingly breezy, but somehow also exceptionally firm, as if the outcome was set in stone, as if she was merely repeating an established fact. Kazuki's internal calculations must have established something very close to a 100% possibility that more of us would die in this place. I repeatedly asked her about the details of her predictions, receiving only variations of the frustrating non-answer. If I told you, the future I predicted would change. When I finally told her that changing this future sounded like a pretty good idea to me, she coolly replied, even if it would mean none of us survive at all, and I found myself in that utter loss for words. Well, maybe not utter. There was still one old reliable that came to mind.
で
Don't look at me like that. I'm perfectly aware that I'm an idiot. You don't have to rub it in. Even now, Kazuki said the possibility of everyone surviving wasn't quite zero. By believing in those words, I could hold on to hope. If I had hope, I could find the strength to go on. Yeah, that's right. I have to be stronger than this. But it was hard. It was very hard. A full 2 days had passed since Mr. Ochi left the camp, and as always, there were no signs of rescuers active nearby. Naturally, our teacher hadn't returned either. Jeez. Bye.